This episode is made possible by our generous patrons. To learn more, visit patreon.com/ink2film.
Welcome to the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book
And then see the movie.
I'm Luke.
And I'm James.
And this week, with the help of special guest Fonda Lee, we cover Mario Puzo's 1969 novel, The Godfather. We're pleased to welcome a very special guest to help us cover The Godfather, Fonda Lee. Fonda is the author of the Greenbone Saga, which begins with JADE City, which recently won the 2018 World Fantasy Award for Best Novel, and was nominated for both the Nebula Award and the Locust Award. Fonda is also the author of young adult novels ZEROBOXER, EXO, and Crossfire, which have garnered numerous accolades as well. Oh, and she holds black belts in both karate and kung fu, making her literally one of the most badass writers around. Welcome, Fonda.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks so much for coming on.
It's so cool to have you on. It's awesome, for this project especially.
Well, you did say, do you want to spend several hours talking about the Godfather book and movies? And I was like, actually, yes, I want to do that. So I'm excited to be here.
That's amazing. We love the enthusiasm.
Well, the Godfather movies and book have definitely had an impact on my own writing. So I think there's plenty of stuff I could geek out about over the material for a while.
It's one of those things where you go back and visit something that is clearly foundational for so many things that came after. Mm-hmm. And it made me think of, I was thinking of Game of Thrones. I was thinking all these different things and seeing all these connections to The Godfather, because I'm realizing that this book obviously came first and it had to be such a big influence for things, and especially once it got into pop culture through the films. Just really cool to see that for myself. So I could definitely see how that could be an influence.
I also have been surprised by the number of people who don't know that The Godfather started out as a book. And oftentimes I will talk about the book and I'll have people say, it's a book? Because they're familiar with the movies. And, obviously, just the star power of the actors at the time, Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, the movies have really eclipsed the book in terms of their importance in pop culture. But it all started with this book, and so I'm glad that we're having a chance to actually talk about both the original material and then the films that spawned out of it.
Yeah, I was one of those, actually. I didn't know that the book existed until fairly recently, and that's why this podcast is so great, because it really lets me see where these projects came from. And I was really surprised, because as I read, the films stayed very close to the books. For those films, like you said, they broke into pop culture and they become so culturally relevant because they went on to shape cinema. And it's just interesting because I think that overshadows the fact that there was a book that it was there at the time. So it's cool to come back around to it and really hopefully we can give it its due.
Yeah, I mean it for me, I haven't read the book or seen the film. I know. But I'm so glad that I'm able to do it for the first time for the show. I think it should make it for an interesting experience. But of course, I've sort of absorbed a lot of this stuff through pop culture. There's an episode of Futurama that very strongly references The Godfather throughout. And I kept thinking of it because that was my touchstone for this material a little bit. But then there's also just so many sayings that came up. I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse, and stuff like that I didn't know was from The Godfather, but I've definitely heard a million times. So it was really cool to see that origin. And then, yeah, like you said, because that's what we do on this podcast. That happened with us for Jaws, for Die Hard. There's been several ones that people don't even know that is based off a book.
One of the major things that I noticed in my reading this time that I was kind of drawing comparisons to was Breaking Bad. I really was feeling like a Breaking Bad vibe.
Any crime show or book or movie probably owes a lot to Godfather.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the things that it just speaks to the power of this franchise is that if you Google, top movies of the last 100 years or top movies ever, oftentimes you will see The Godfather and The Godfather Part 2 on that list. And if you ever hear, that sort of raspy, like Marlon Brando imitation voice, you immediately know where that's from. So it's become so iconic. But The Godfather, the book, is an interesting animal because I've read it several times, and it always elicits a bit of a mixed reaction from me because I believe it's in many ways a brilliant book, but also deeply flawed. And this is one of the instances I almost always tell people that the book is better than the movie in like 95% of cases.
Same.
Yeah, that I would say most of the time I find the source material superior to the adaptation. But in this case, I really believe that Francis Ford Coppola exceeded the original material, and he did something really incredible with the Godfather films that rightfully eclipsed the Godfather. And the book itself is incredible work, but there's also parts of it that just are baffling and bizarre.
I'm so glad that you're saying all of these things right now because you're saying everything that I feel. It's
so flawed in some ways, and then there's parts that are just so iconic that stick with you. Mm-hmm. And so I always have this kind of like weird relationship with The Godfather, where it's this book I love, and yet am very glad that it was not completely faithfully adapted for the films, and that the filmmakers made some really good choices to make the films, I think, better than some of the source material. So
Luke and I have had this conversation countless times at this point because it's the nature of this podcast, but the book being better than the movie thing, I also tend to agree with it. The source material usually just let you, like in a book, you're able to dive so much more into it. But I felt like you were just saying, I was worried that I was going to come in here and just like rain on everybody's parade. And I was a little worried that everybody was going to be like, oh, it's a flawless book. But I thought that it was less focused, like much less focused than the movies. The things that they cut elevated this film in such a crazy way. So I'm glad to hear you say that because I agree.
Yeah. No, there's whole parts of this book that every time I read it, I just skim as quickly as possible. And there's and there's also parts where I stop and I savor, every part of it. So so it is a very uneven book for me, and especially because I feel like there's parts of this book that it's almost like Puzo was trying to pad his word count. And I wonder about that because, and Luke, maybe you can speak to this a little bit more, but Puzo had written, at the time he wrote The Godfather, he had written 2 other books. So The Godfather was his 3rd novel. Mm-hmm. And he had written these other 2 books that were really critically acclaimed. So he had written The Dark Arena, and then he'd written The Fortunate Pilgrim. And they were both well received critically, but they didn't make him any money. I can relate to that feeling as an author where you're like, hey, I'm doing some pretty good work, but like I really need to, pay the mortgage and buy groceries and stuff like that. So, for his 3rd novel, he set out, he basically was like, I am writing this book to make money. And like, the critical acclaim, screw that. Like, I just want to write something that makes money. And so he started writing The Godfather, and it feels like there's parts of it that are very soap opera-ish that he put in there largely to kind of titillate, or he's got like this whole Hollywood subplot and like scenes with the whole. I mean, what is the point of even most of the subplot involving Fontane and his like womanizing exploits? There's so much of it.
That's a great question.
And not to mention the other super notable subplot that we're definitely going to get to is the trip to the doctor with the doctor in Vegas. And it's like, what is this? What is this for?
Right. I mean, what? Why? And so I often feel like, maybe he was just trying to add the soap opera-ish element or titillate and pad his word count, because no one needed that amount of detail. So bizarre. Yeah. And so thank goodness that's something you can completely cut out of the book and not lose any of the impact. But I mean, he clearly succeeded. The book went on to be picked up by Hollywood and sell a bazillion copies. But like I said, parts of it, you're like, what, where, what, why?
Yeah. I mean, maybe someone told him, like, you got to have sex, you got to have violence. I mean, this was also written in 1969, so I feel like it was probably pretty edgy for its time with all this content.
It feels to me like very 60s, like it's a little sleazy in times.
Oh, sure.
Yes. And he, I think, really meant to create that pulp kind of tone. I mean, it has that kind of like pulp feel to it. And it almost despite itself is elevated to a higher level.
Well, we've already gotten a little bit into his bio, so I'm just going to go over a little bit more, just so we can fully talk about Puzo here. So he was born in Hell's Kitchen, in the area of New York City in 1920 to a poor family from Italy. Many of his books draw heavily on this heritage. After graduating from the City College of New York, he joined the U.S. Army Air Forces in World War II. Because of his poor eyesight, he was not allowed to undertake combat duties, but he was made a public relations officer stationed in Germany. Puzo then returned to New York, where he attended the New School for Social Research, then Columbia University. So during the 1950s and early 1960s, Puzo worked as a writer-editor for publisher Martin Goodman's magazine management company. The company's lines of men's magazines, pulp titles like Mail, True Action, and Swank, under the pseudonym Mario Cleary, and he also wrote the World War II adventure features for True Action. So maybe that's where that pulp background comes from. Like, he was literally writing for men's magazines.
Yeah, I can see that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and then so like you referenced, so he had written to critical acclaim, but not for a lot of money. So his publisher told him that he thought if the mafia plotline had been more prominent in The Fortunate Pilgrim, it would have been more successful. So he decided to write a story outline for The Godfather. It was rejected by the publisher, but he was able to find a publisher eventually, and it sold based off of the outline. So he used a lot of anecdotes he had heard throughout the years working at the Pulp magazine about mafia organizations. But he actually wasn't a part of the mafia. I don't know if people think he actually was, but he wasn't. This is all just done through research, not like direct. Although he grew up in that area and was Italian, so I feel like a lot of it was probably going on at the time he was growing up.
Yeah, I actually read some stuff about Puzo that he really did not, wasn't drawing really from nonfiction research when he created the Corleone Family. He created this fantasy, if you will, of what the mafia was in his mind, no doubt based on things he had heard and his own imagining and the background that he had. But it's not as if he went and interviewed any real gangsters. And it's fascinating because after The Godfather achieved so much mainstream success, what you have seen is real life gangsters almost modeling themselves after the fantasy gangsters that Puzo created. So there's this interesting like life imitating art, imitating life cycle going on because Puzo's gangsters were so compelling stylistically and just their moral code that it kind of filtered in and affected real life. It wasn't as if he had based those characters on specific people, and it was much more fictional than I think a lot of people realize.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking throughout that this family was. The Godfather himself is almost set up as like a Batman type character who's really just like, because the system has failed everybody, so he's out there, like cleaning up and getting real justice for people.
And not to mention he has like this code, right? He's honorable while being a criminal. So it's like, and I want to give him props for the fact that like the core elements in this book that went on to be in the film are fantastic. Like I think the family dynamic and the way that they have that set up and the intrigue, the political intrigue. You talked about Game of Thrones, Luke. That it's reminded me of that so much. But just like the first scene, the wedding, like that's like it pulled me in. It's so iconic. So I think with all the stuff being said that we said before, I do want to say like Don Corleone is one of the most iconic characters ever, and he created him, and he would go on to be played by Marlon Brando.
Yeah, and it's also really a testament to Puzo's, the strength of this novel's opening, that Puzo reframes the moral context of the entire book in the first chapter, because he has a task ahead of him when he sets out in this book. He has to basically make the reader empathize with a criminal kingpin. And he does that really skillfully, because he opens with these minor characters who've all suffered injustice in the world, right? We've got the baker who needs to have his son-in-law immigrate. We've got the Bonacera, whose daughter has been assaulted, and he's not getting justice from, the courts. So we have all these minor characters who have nowhere else to turn. And then Puzo sets up Don Corleone as the social benefactor. So right away what he does is he tells the reader, hey, this lawful world that you, the reader, believe in is actually flawed and unjust. And here I'm going to give you this character who makes everything right. And so afterwards, no matter what the Corleones do, you're on their side. And there's this thing that we writers do, which is like the first impression of a character really stays with the reader, and they want to hang on to it. So I think it's really important as a writer to think about how you introduce your protagonist, because that's going to have this lingering effect throughout the entire novel. And Puzo does that really well. It's interesting in particular because he has these three characters who want different things. The three sort of minor characters that go to Don Corleone and ask for favors, right? We've got one character who wants vengeance. We've got one character who wants respect, right? Fontaine is basically kind of lost respect. And we want influence, the guy who wants, the immigration papers for his son-in-law. So those are three things that are especially difficult for immigrants to a new country to come to. And The Godfather has often been described as like this archetypal story of the immigrant experience in America, because it's about these characters who come to America to find a good life and fortune for their family. And so that's also part of the appeal of the Corleones, that they are immigrants to America, and they've carved out their own life and power and influence in this land that they're not native to. So you've got these things kind of going on with like these characters who have come to this country and the system is failing them, but here Don Corleone will take care of you. And it's really masterful how Puzo sets up the characters so that all of a sudden you're like rooting for these mafia guys the whole book.
Yeah, and to what you're saying, he even tells a character like that's what you get for I forget how he phrases it, but it's like that's what you get for trusting in the American justice system when you should have been trusting me.
Right.
I also love the friendship element. Like it's all framed as friendship. It's not threatening.
Yeah.
It's and the way that he goes about it is just like it's endearing. I think that's another reason why readers are attracted to him.
Oh, it was brilliant. Him collecting favors and friendship, and it's all just respect, and there's all this rich subtext of what's going on in all these scenes, but nobody addresses it outright. So cool. Very, very cleverly done. So I did want to speak on the success of the novel. This is something that is amazing to me because, like we said, a lot of people don't know this is based off of a novel. The novel remained on the New York Times bestseller list for 67 weeks. And sold over 9 million copies in 2 years. And it was published in 1969, and I believe the film came out in 1972. So that's before the first film. So before the first film even came out, it sold 9 million copies. It became the best-selling published work in history for several years. And yet, here we are with a lot of people who don't even know it was based off the book. So it's kind of amazing. I guess it also shows the power of these films that came after.
It also, I bet you if you asked like the generation above us, I'm sure they all knew it was a book. Like it might be an age gap thing because it's like 69.
Yeah, but still, like it shows what has the legacy and what maybe doesn't, right?
That's actually a little depressing to me as an author.
Right.
I think that like you can write this book that it spends 2 years on the New York Times bestseller list, sells 9 million copies, and then the movie comes along and all anyone can talk about are the movies.
Yeah,
that's actually kind of depressing.
Well,
for my writer soul.
Yeah, and at least his movies were good. You would hate for that to be the opposite, where it's like the movie was so bad that that's all anyone remembers too.
Right.
Maybe like a middle ground where the movie's pretty good, but the book is clearly better. Maybe that's the sweet spot. He also wrote the screenplay for both The Godfather and Godfather 2 and the eventual Godfather Part 3, which we can mention later, which isn't really adapted from this novel. And then he also wrote other screenplays. Like he wrote a screenplay for the film Earthquake.
And Superman, I believe.
Yeah. Richard Donner's Superman, and which also included the plot for Superman 2. He also collaborated on stories A Time to Die and Francis Ford Coppola's The Cotton Club.
Wow.
And then he ended up dying of heart failure in 1999 in his home in Manor Lane in New York, which I thought was interesting because we see that that's how the Godfather himself dies in this book.
Yeah.
So I don't know, there's like interesting kind of life imitating art imitating life thing there too. Like, the original Godfather himself, Puzo.
Yeah. It's interesting. I've also read a number of Puzo's other works. So after the success of The Godfather, he wrote a number of other mafia novels. So he wrote The Sicilian, The Last Dawn, Omerta, and a few others that aren't coming to me immediately. In my mind, the other two that I think are really quite excellent that he's written are The Sicilian and The Last Dawn. Some of his later mafia novels really take a nosedive. Like you can tell he's kind of just trying to cash in on the fact that he's Mario Puzo and he can, write whatever and have it succeed, because they really they're really not as good as I think what I think of as like his peak powers, which were really The Godfather, The Sicilian, The Last Dawn, in my mind, are kind of the triumvirate of Puzo's work.
Now, is The Sicilian also within the Corleone family stuff, or is it a totally different story?
So it is a totally different story, but it includes Michael Corleone as a secondary character. So it takes place during the period when Michael Corleone is in Sicily, and he is asked to do a favor, basically to help somebody there. And there's a whole story. So it's not about Michael Corleone, but he kind of comes in as a secondary character. So it's connected to The Godfather, but is its own story entirely.
Interesting.
That's really cool. So before we get along too far into the plot, I did want to mention that I have had a copy of Jade City for a while, and I've been dying to read it. And what we've decided to do is we're going to read it during our coverage of the films, which are going to be our next 2 episodes. And James and I are going to try and read the novel as much, probably try and finish it for next week for the Godfather. And then we're going to make some comparisons because I know that was a big inspiration for you, or at least a small inspiration for you.
Yeah, so my novel Jade City has been described on many occasions as The Godfather with magic and kung fu.
I'm sold.
Yeah.
So that's
a great pitch, right?
And it works. It really does because the novel is a blend of my love of gangster stories and films, both from Western culture, like The Godfather, Goodfellas, Scarface, Scorsese films, etc., and Eastern culture, including Hong Kong crime dramas, Johnny To's films, Infernal Affairs, Election, etc. So they blend kind of a martial arts Asian crime drama sensibility with the family saga political maneuvering elements of The Godfather. So clearly, there's inspiration there and elements of The Godfather that stuck with me for so long that they influenced parts of my own story. But it's a great pitch line because Well, because everyone knows what The Godfather is, and then add magic and kung fu, and you kind of get a sense of what the book is, and it's very accurate.
That's awesome.
So I did want to ask you guys about mafia stories in general and how they strike you, because I have this issue. Like I love the Scorsese films, and I typically will enjoy a mafia film, but I find it hard to watch mafia films occasionally because I always compare them to The Godfather. And I always feel like I'm just gonna get a different version of something like that, and that's not because obviously Goodfellas is completely different, and as you said, there are plenty of mafia films out there, but I find it really interesting because this just seems like the gold standard to me.
So I have watched a lot of mafia films, and The Godfather is always the gold standard for me because there is something in it that I don't find in the others, and that is this emphasis on the family and that, like, essentially the saga of family and friendship that's at the core of The Godfather. A lot of other mafia films, honestly, are about gangsters killing each other, often like some sort of turf war, or someone betrays somebody, or like some sort of plot involving the cops. Think of like Untouchables, which is also a great
film.
Mafia film, right? Great film, very different though. So a lot of other mafia films kind of focus on the crime element and on that war between the crime element and lawful society.
Right. It makes me think of The Departed as well.
Yes, The Departed, another great film. So that is at the crux of a lot of the mafia films. Whereas for me, The Godfather is more about the family and about these characters. And you can almost, I would never take away that crime element because it's so intrinsic, but it fades into the background. The fact that these characters are mafia almost becomes like a secondary consideration for the audience. And that's why, to me, The Godfather succeeds above a lot of other mafia stories, because it's the betrayals and the events that happen, the deaths, like they feel, I think, more human than what you get from a lot of other crime drama films.
Yeah, well, and for me, it was that experience of I didn't realize there was this massive touchstone. I mean, I guess I realized it, but I didn't know in all the ways in which it is a touchstone. And now that it's fallen into place, and I'm sure this will continue to happen when I see the films, all of these comparisons are just like cascading in, and I'm like, oh my God, this is clearly the progenitor of so much. Mm-hmm. So that's been really fun for me because like I said, I don't know anything about this story until this week when I read it. So before we get into the plot as well, I wanted to ask you, because we always do this when we have guests on, when was your first time reading the book? When was your first time seeing the movie, if you can remember, and which came first?
So I saw the movie first, and I can't remember when I saw it, but it was probably sometime in my maybe late teens or early 20s, so quite a while ago. And and then watched, obviously, the other Godfather movie. So I came to the book after having seen the movies and read it probably, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. So
that's pretty recent.
Yeah, so relatively recent. So I had been like a fan of the movies long before I read the book, and so kind of that I think really caused me to sort of draw comparisons throughout as I was reading the book.
Cool. James, before we get into plot, I wanted to ask you, so you have seen the film, but you had never read the book. So what was like your general takeaway from reading the book for the first time?
Well, other than the stuff that we talked about before, where I felt like it was less focused, I did enjoy getting a little more context for some of the main family characters, like understanding more of where they were coming from. I was wondering how much more we would get from Michael's point of view, because in the movie, obviously, we're not in his head. So I wanted to see his his turning from good to corrupt, or whatever you want to call it. His fall from grace, or
his embracing of the family business.
Exactly, when he embraces it. So I thought that we would get a little more of that, and I honestly didn't get much more than what is really in the film. But I do love that arc too, though. I love seeing him reluctantly take the role and then just being so good at it.
That brings up to me the interest. One of the interesting notes I had was the POV and how this novel like you said, it opens with the three characters who all need things, and then they all come to the Godfather. But when it comes to the Godfather, we get a omniscient kind of bird's eye view. So you get a lot of statements about like, this is the way things are, right? And so this is the way. And so when we're told that this is how the Godfather is, it's not leaving any room for debate. It's not like this is one character's perception of the Godfather. It's basically God telling us this is how things are.
That's another thing, is I felt like he was more than just this like patriarchal figurehead, or like even the brains behind it. Like, he really did feel like he was his own government, he was his own religion, he was God in this story. Like, he is a god to all of these people. The fact that they think of his word as gospel, anything he says is going to come true no matter the odds. He really is like this god in their eyes, I think.
There's a very interesting scene near the beginning of the book that I think is meaningful for a specific reason. So the Godfather meets with all these different people who come to petition him, and it's as his daughter's wedding. So as a Sicilian, he cannot refuse them, right? That's kind of part of that cultural context. And then after the wedding, he goes to the hospital to see his former consigliere, who is now on his deathbed. And in this scene, his consigliere, Genko, is dying and begs the Godfather to save him from death. And basically says, if death comes to me, he sees you, he's going to be afraid, and save me from death, Godfather. So, that does two things. It reinforces the power that Don Corleone has, the thrall that he holds everyone in, that they would ask him for anything, including, asking him to spare them from death itself. But of course, Genko dies, and the Godfather basically says, prepare yourself, like, you're going to die tonight, and there's nothing I can do about it. So it also tells the reader there's only one thing that the Godfather cannot cheat, and that's death. And that is like, he can basically solve all the other problems. He can get, Fontane this part in this movie. He can intimidate his rivals. He can influence politicians. He can do all this stuff. But the one thing he can't cheat is death. And that kind of becomes this turning point. And there's so many parts in the plot that are really based, on this fact that death is all these plot points revolve around betrayal or assassination or death itself.
I was going to talk about that specific part too. I'm glad you zeroed in on the same scene. It was in, like, you talking about it just gave me chills. So it really works well, and it is. And I also like that we see that Vito also kind of acknowledges that is his one thing he has no power over. And we see him throughout thinking about his own mortality and how he knows that he won't live forever and that it's going to have to be passed on. So in another way, he's kind of humble in a certain sense, and that he knows he is aware of the limits of his own power. Whereas instead of a character who is like believes his own press and thinks he's invincible, which would be a very different character.
Right. And, at one point I remember hearing an interview with Francis Ford Coppola, where he said he read The Godfather. He had been tasked to turn this into a movie. He read The Godfather, and he really zeroed in on the fact that this is a story about succession. And that really speaks to what you just said, which is the Godfather is aware of his own mortality. No matter how much power he has in this life, this thing that he has built has to be passed on. And to one of his children. So the story is also very much about succession. I want to come back to something that you said, Luke, which was the authorial voice and the distance that Puzo employs. Right, he has that omniscient POV, and he moves around around the different heads of the characters. There's sort of I guess the prevailing trend in fiction these days is, I would say, tends to be against omniscient voice. You always hear the writing advice like, oh, don't head hop, right? But here you have an author who's working, several decades prior, who head hops very frequently, and I think quite effectively. And one thing that he does is create this narrative distance in the way he tells the story. Not just the fact that there's an omniscient voice and there's this narrator basically telling you how things are, but the way that he comes about some of the major plot points is interesting. He has this habit of basically like telling you what happened and then backtracking to show it. Mm-hmm. So this happens both when, first of all, when Vito is shot, the attempted assassination, is a scene where Michael learns about it from the newspaper, and then he backtracks to tell you what happened. And of course, the scene where Bonacera, he gets a call in the middle of the night and he's wondering what the heck is going to happen and what's the Godfather going to ask him to do. And that's how you find out that Sonny has been killed. Yeah. And then he goes back in the previous chapter to lay out how it happened. And it's an interesting choice. And I'm kind of, it's strange because that's sort of unintuitive. It's like the opposite of how I think most authors would try to do that, is that you would want to be with the character during those big moments. But Puzo has this way of making it seem very removed, almost. Yeah. It's like you're learning about it from the newspaper. You're learning about it from like a minor character, and then you're like, what happened? And he goes back.
For me, I had a note about that specifically because I was puzzling over that myself, going, why does he choose to do this? And I think there are certain effects he gets from it, and one of them I kept coming back to was the feeling that this was all fated. And so whenever like something would happen, I don't know, just the fact that we're moving back and forth in time made it feel like this story has occurred. And we're going to tell you the way it happened, and it cannot be changed. It's immutable, and it was always going to happen this way. Instead of the sense of, like, I'm following along a story and anything can happen at any moment, it kind of felt more like I was being told this tale, this epic tale of something that has already transpired. And, yeah, and because of that, he's jumping around. And then the other thing it does is I think it also hooks you in a way, because you're like, wait, what happened? How did that happen? And then so when you read that story, you were like, oh, now I'm going to get the real version of what happened, not just what somebody heard. And then so I was always like, those scenes I was incredibly primed for when I read them. I was so excited to read about what actually happened to Sonny, and so excited to read about the actual shooting of the Godfather. So in those ways it worked for me. But yeah, it is kind of odd. I feel like I've seen it done a couple times and always to elicit some sort of effect similar to this. But yeah, I don't feel like it's done a lot today. At least I haven't seen it a lot in modern writing. All right, so let's get into a little bit of the plot itself. So I normally pull up like a plot summary for whatever we've covered, and we kind of break it up into pieces. All the plot summary I was finding online are for the films. Once again, talking about how like massive the films are, it was very hard to find something for the book. But I did find a short bit here, which you'll see covers a lot. But we can kind of just like break this up into chunks and talk about it. So yeah, I'm going to do 4 chunks. So first off, after dawn, Vito Corleone is shot by men working for the drug dealer Virgil the Turk Solozzo. I'm probably going to butcher some of these names, so I apologize for that. His 2 sons, Santino, Sonny, and Michael, must run the family business with the help of the consigliere. I'm not probably saying
consigliere,
that right. Yeah. I'm going to struggle with some of these Italian phrases. I apologize for that. Tom Hagen and the 2 capos, Peter Clemenza and Salvatore Tessio. So when Solozzo and an Irish police captain are murdered by Michael, the conflict escalates into a full-scale war, which results in Santino's death and Michael, despite his wishes, ascending to the head of the family. So, we discovered a lot of the book. So I want to back up a little bit before we get any further and talk about how that all goes down. Especially I thought the entire thing with like Michael being drawn back in and then kind of taking charge and saying he's going to kill this cop and Solozzo. That was so cool. And I thought it was interesting how he played with expectations there a little bit. Yeah,
I think, the character arc of Michael Corleone is that like prodigal son, right? The fact that he comes back and sort of he doesn't want to be part of the family business, and he wants to marry Kay, and goes off and joins the army against his father's wishes. So he's set up as this character who is reluctantly drawn back, but then of course turns out to be the most talented of his siblings at actually doing this, and takes this on. So there is a line near the end of the book, and I marked it down. I think it's page 445. But there's this line at the end where Tom goes to talk to Kay, Mike's wife, and she's found out that Michael has killed Carlo Rizzi. And she's taken the kids and she's kind of sequestered herself somewhere. And Tom goes to talk to her, and Kay says, Michael is not the man that she married. And Tom says, if he was, he would be dead. And that I think it's a great kind of nice character encapsulation, because it's basically like it's Michael's both ascent to power and his and a fall morally, because in order to succeed in this world, he has to make moral compromises and do things that put him at odds with the person that she thought she married, and it's a great character arc, because it's working, on two levels. You're rooting for him to succeed as Godfather, and you also know that it's going to cost him, which is a theme that's explored a lot more in the films, especially in the second film, than it is in the book. The book really kind of ends with with Michael on the ascendancy, and Michael kind of now the new crowned king, and doesn't go beyond that. The second film, Godfather Part 2, really kind of digs more into like the reign of Michael Corleone, which I think is an improvement.
I'm excited for that now.
Yeah.
So I wanted to mention how, to me, family is such a big part of this book, and specifically, there's sort of talking about that fated sense. There's also sort of an inescapable, like the crimes of the father being passed on to the children, and like how they can't, like they are born into this family and they can't escape it. And I think anyone who comes from a family, like especially like a big family, can sort of feel that like pull of like there are just certain things that you're born into, and then you have to deal with, and you have to decide, am I going to go this route or am I going to go this route? And so in that sense, it is kind of universal. But I think just specifically talking about that, I think it's a really interesting part of this book, and I'm sure the film.
Yeah, definitely. There's clearly family is a huge theme in the book, a huge part of the story. One of my favorite characters, if not my favorite character, is Tom Hagen, because he is chosen to be part of this family. He's not blood related to the Corleones. He was adopted into the family, and his character is really set up nicely in this one part where he, after finishing law school, he tells the Godfather, "I want to work for you, and I would be one of your sons." So, Tom is a great character because he's cautious, and he is level-headed, and he's loyal, and he's chosen to be part of this family. And the other characters, they sort of represent their different relationships with this legacy that their father has left them. You've got Santino, who's very much just like embraces it, and especially like the violent aspects of it, he's just like all in. And Fredo,
he wants it too much almost.
Right, almost wants it too much. And then Fredo, who isn't cut out for it, and is basically, and you'll see later on in the movies, destroyed by it. And then Michael, who doesn't want to be a part of it, but is fated to be a part of it. So those are different elements of the family dynamics are really the kind of compelling character pieces that make The Godfather, I think, so much more than just your typical like mafia story.
Yeah. You're talking about Hagen. I want to go back to him for a second. I also find his character very interesting because he's newly appointed, so he's green and he's trying to figure it out. And you can see when things go wrong, and with the characters start to say that he's not a wartime. I want to ask what you guys think of that first. What do you think about the fact that the characters keep saying that he's not a wartime? Like, Do you feel like it was just because he didn't have it, like he didn't have the stomach for it? Was it because he wasn't Sicilian, like they kept talking about?
Yeah. It is interesting because I think there's a certain tribalism and surrounding race that is absolutely like a huge part of this book. And yeah, he is like one character who plays against that a little bit because he's not Sicilian yet. But then there's also this weird thing of like them accepting him as Sicilian. So there's this weird like assimilation thing that happens. But then it's still like he's never quite there. So there's a lot tied up in like bloodlines and all this stuff. And some of that, I mean, it made me uncomfortable, but I also think it's kind of the point to an extent too. But I don't know if I'm giving them too much credit in that regard. What do you think about that, Fonda?
Yeah, I mean, I think Tom is he is in the family, and yet he's also he doesn't have there's this line I think in the book where where Don Corleone he says something like you're not Sicilian, but I made you into one. And so he's kind of Sicilian by naturalization, if you will. But to your point, James, of like, is he not a wartime consigliere? There's the scene where the Godfather this is the classic like horse's head in the bed scene, right? Where he's intimidating. He basically like responds to Woltz's unwillingness to cast Fontane by destroying his most prized possession, which is this racehorse, and leaving the head in his bed. And he instructs Tom to do this, to kind of make all the arrangements for it. And Woltz wakes up and he's like horrified by this because he realizes that what the Godfather's power is this willingness to just exact brutal violence on principle. Without like any warning, without any threats, without any like grandstanding, without any like, cock waving kind of drama. He's just like, well, all right, this is going to be this is the way it's going to be, I guess.
Yeah.
And that's what frightens him, right? Is he realizes like this, that he has all this power and this money and influence, and it doesn't matter. This olive oil importer is willing to kill him out of principle. And that's sort of that Sicilian moral code that is both sort of terrifying and really compelling. And I think that is something that Tom lacks. Tom is like that kind of really cool-headed guy who's a great business counsel to the family, but he doesn't have that kind of just sort of cold, innate brutality that both Vito Corleone and Michael have. He's kind of reluctant to get Michael to be the assassin. Even when Michael's like, it has to be me, I got to be the one who does it. Michael's like, Tom is like, is there any other way? Like he's trying to think of other ways that he doesn't have to do it. There's the scenes where Sonny is on the warpath against the Tattaglias and Solezzo, and Tom is really trying to moderate him, and saying like, if, as consigliere, I would tell you to make the deal, right? Like, I would also want to take vengeance, but like, that'll just lead to this huge war, and he's trying to moderate some of Sonny's violent impulses.
Yeah, it seems like he's very caught up in wanting to keep the peace. He ultimately doesn't want bloodshed. Maybe he acknowledges that it is occasionally necessary, but it also feels like he wants to avoid it at all costs, whereas that's not necessarily true for the other characters.
But what's interesting, I guess, is the difference between the Don and the consigliere then. Because that's exactly what I feel like Don doesn't want either. He doesn't want violence. He wants to try to solve everything with business. But he realizes that sometimes things need to be done.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's the difference, the key difference.
And
there.
also, it's interesting that you say that, because part of the nature of violence in this story is how cold and long it takes to exact it. So, like, for example, they know that for a long time, they know that Carlo betrayed Sonny and led to his death. And yet Carlo is kind of like still living in the family compound and married to, the daughter, Connie, and Michael knows this. and stands as godfather to their child. And, part of me's like, well, gosh, if they knew Carlo was a traitor all along, why did they let him live on their family compound for so long and wait for years until they finally knock him off at the end? But, they didn't want to kind of show, my read on it is they didn't want to show their hand. Don Vito knew that he had made this pact with the other families. He had made the peace, and he had done it all so he could make sure Michael came back safely without any hassles. Michael would assume leadership, but he wasn't going to forget anything that had happened. He wasn't responsible because he had stepped down by that point. In fact, he's dead by that point, that Michael kind of has his huge final reckoning. But they're willing to make the peace, to do whatever, to play nice, but they're never gonna forget. They're gonna come back, and there's gonna be a reckoning. Michael knows that Fabrizio, the guy who is responsible for the car bomb in Sicily, is working at this pizza parlor. He knows this for years before he has the guy whacked. So that sort of idea, vengeance is a dish best served cold, is prevalent throughout all of this.
I think Vito even says that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I love the time that Michael just lets the cop hit him, and he lets him punch him to put him to the ground, and then doesn't freak out about it. Actually, I think he passes out, but he doesn't retaliate, and he knows that it's going to be something where he's now seen as I think it's just the edge that I think Don Vito and Michael have is just like you said, the patience to wait and pull the trigger at the right time. One
of the things we should talk about is the role of women in this book, which is very. This book is very misogynistic. In the sense that it's. This culture of, it's an extremely machismo culture that's portrayed. And, I think even though we get the POVs occasionally of Kay and then Lucy Mancini, who is Sonny's mistress, the women in this book are really come in kind of different flavors of victim and bystander and mob wife, and the way that they exist in this world really allows them very little agency. And I am absolutely fine with reading books in which sexism and misogyny and patriarchy are part of the world or the structures, but I think it's one thing to portray the world in that way and then have characters who still have agency or fight against it. But the characters in this book that Puzo has written really don't. They're very, very, very shallowly drawn. And that's one part of the book that, is and granted it was written in a different generation, but is disappointing when you read it because you're like, gosh, this really sucks. Connie she's like this royal daughter, if you will, and she's beaten up by her asshole of a husband the whole book. Yeah. And, the Kay seems almost like it's almost like Michael tries to warn her in so many different ways about what she's getting into. And
I love that it's a joke at first too. He's joking about how it's dangerous and how she shouldn't get involved.
Yeah. And of course she still marries him and gets involved anyways. And then is somehow disappointed and surprised at the end. I'm like, come on. You knew what you were getting into. There was all these signs. So that is an element that is very weird and disappointing, especially when you combine it with the fact that there's this whole unnecessary vaginal subplot.
Oh my God! Yeah,
let's talk about that.
Why do we need the surgery subplot? What was that about?
It was like he had read some article somewhere and just decided, I'm going to put this in the book.
Yeah. The crazy thing to me was that I was like, it's going to pay off. I was like, there's a reason that this happened, and I feel like at the end of the book something's going to happen, and nothing ever happened.
No,
Nothing
no.
happened.
No, there's no reason.
It just was. It was ridiculous. Yeah.
So there is a reason. The reason I want to like put forward, and this is like, I'm not defending this reason, but I think it's the reason, is a lot of this novel to me felt like wish fulfillment on top of all the other things we've talked about, and wish fulfillment on the part of the types of characters that are like Michael Corleone and Sonny and people who are around that kind of life. He wanted this book to be like the ultimate wish fulfillment for those people, and so like you said, the women characters in this book all just feed back into this and don't really fight it at all, and just back it up and say that this is, great. And we see them all like there's a really gross part where Connie's getting beat up, but she's like sexually turned on and all this stuff, and like it just all feeds back into the idea that this is all the way it should be, in a sense. And we don't see any character really fighting back against it, which I was very disappointed with too. Like I really wanted to see like Connie really push back against it, or Kay, and instead we see all of these characters giving very little resistance to this lifestyle and just fully accepting it and even like playing into it. And then that whole vaginal subplot is so gross because it's very much like this like fantasy on the part of the doctor, and the way it's set up, it really that read just like straight out of like a weird pulp, 60s magazine thing to me, because it was pretty gross.
Other than that ridiculous subplot, the thing that was the most icky to me is so we get the one female character who does fight back, right? She's Johnny Fontane's like current wife. When we start the story,
his ex-wife.
She like actively like doesn't like she does whatever she wants and she shows some agency. But then the part that I think is icky is that we get to the point where Johnny goes to the Don, and the Don is like, that's because you're not treating her how you should be treating her as a man. and that was the craziest part to me, was that it's just like every single one of the characters, it's like if some of the characters, I guess it's like you were saying, it's not just a couple characters who are showing this to add to their depth of a character. It's literally the entire book. It's just saying that this is how things, like you said, wish fulfillment, and this is how either the author felt or the people who were reading it, he felt like the audience would react well to it. So,
well, I think, it's part of the culture that he's created where, women are really objects and not really something that figures into the cold-blooded calculations of these alpha males. And I think that's best seen in the scene where Hagen goes to talk to Jack Woltz. And he's giving Jack Woltz all these reasons why he should cast Johnny Fontane. He'll have the Godfather's friendship, and it's going to help him with his labor union problems and all this stuff. And Woltz basically says, well, I'm not ever going to give the part to Fontane because he slept with this starlet that I was cultivating, and he ruined her, and she was such a great piece of ass, blah, blah, blah. And Woltz himself is disgusting because there's that really icky part where, there's this like little teenage girl that...
I think she's like 12.
Yeah. So you already know Woltz is really gross. And he basically tells Hagen, like, well, I'm not going to give, it doesn't matter what you tell me, because Fontane slept with this girl I wanted, blah, blah, blah. So he's basically saying that, like, this girl was mine and Fontane took her, so I'm not going to do what you want. And Hagen's reaction is astonishment because he sees Woltz as a lesser man, and he knows Woltz is a man of that is not to be regarded well because he's making decisions based on his feelings for a woman, icky as they are. Mm-hmm. And there's actually a line where he's saying something along the lines of, the like appeal of women was like just, not something that would enter into the decision making of, the real man kind of thing. Something along those lines, but he's basically like has a very low opinion of Woltz because of that. So that kind of like really sort of, I think, encapsulates the view both to women, and that's and again reinforced by the lack of women in any sort of really meaningful role. I mean, also, the mother who's, she hears about, like, she knows something horrible has happened and she goes into the kitchen to like cook peppers because like that's all she can do. They're so helpless.
Well, she's like the exemplar of what you're supposed to be in the society, and we even see Kay, at the end praying for Michael in the same way that the mother was said to, in sort of becoming her, and really just like accepting this role fully. And yeah, so that part of it was definitely weird. But I did want to talk about, so we're mentioning a bunch of subplots here. And one thing that we should talk about for the book, because I know a lot of them get cut from the movie, is those subplots. I don't know how much of Johnny Fontane is in the movie, but I'd be interested to hear and like what is added by the extra Johnny Fontane stuff we get, that sort of thing.
I think the only real purpose for Johnny Fontane is to kind of create a subplot that gives the Corleones a out in terms of their move from like the East Coast power base into Vegas. Later on. So there's sort of that connection. But I think Puzo put in Fontane more as kind of a way to sort of tap into that sort of Hollywood celebrity kind of connection to the mafia that like he wanted to draw. I'd read somewhere that he based Fontane on Sinatra.
Wow.
I could totally see that. I was thinking of Sinatra when I was reading him.
So I think that's why Fontane is in there, because Puzo wanted to create this allegorical character and sort of take a dig at Hollywood and working in Hollywood and all the sort of sleaziness of Hollywood, which he knew about having worked in Hollywood. And so that was sort of like a way for him to shoehorn in this allegorical character and bring like sort of Hollywood's culture sleaziness and tie it into the mafia, and then also kind of in the end bring the Corleones west into Vegas and stuff like that. But as a character himself, or as a otherwise, I'm not entirely sure why it has to be given the amount of page time that it's given.
So first off, when I was reading him and it would talk about him singing, that's what it was. Because I started thinking, like, how would this guy sing? Like, what would this sound like? And I immediately thought of Sinatra. Yeah. I was like, oh, clearly he's going to sing like Sinatra. So I was always picturing him doing that kind of vocals. But then, yeah, what you were talking about with how the sleaziness of Hollywood, and Puzo does this a few times, where he brings in something that's worse than. So it's like, oh, we're reading about the brutality of this and the way they treat women is so, bad. But then it's like, oh, but it's not as bad as Hollywood, where it's even worse and these crazy parties and everybody's underage. And so in doing that, he always kind of elevates the family. And you come back to that, it's like, well, at least they're better than this other thing and this other thing. And it's a clever way to make you root for them, because it's like, yeah, they're coming into this world and they're going to be at least have more respect and be more honorable in this honorless place. So yeah, it does, that's an interesting narrative trick he's playing there, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Is that even though there's all these bad things that are going on in the mafia, compared to some of the stuff that's in all. There's actually I think there's a line where Tom is like, well, this guy can become a movie mogul. We should definitely get in the business, because this guy's an idiot and we would make a killing if we got in. And there's speaking of that, another example would be the recruitment of Michael, of that ex-cop, Al Neary, I believe, who used to be a cop. He basically needs his Luca Brasi, right? And he finds this cop who basically is kind of like, is again another of these characters who the system failed him, if you will, right? Like he's a good cop, he believed in the system and it failed him, and now he's beholden to the family. So and the fact that McCluskey is an antagonist and basically is like on the take for the Sollozos. Like Puzo sets it up so like the cops are really no one that you're rooting for here.
Oh yeah, they're all corrupt and terrible.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, which you just mentioned, one of the minor characters, I guess he's minor, Luca Brasi, who I really want to talk about, because I found him really, really interesting, and I loved the way he used that character, and specifically how when he's missing, how like everyone can't stop talking about him, and like really they're like, we'll be fine once we get him in. Where's he at? Can you reach him? And they keep calling him, they can't find him, and it creates again this like huge anticipation for like finding out what happened to him. And then when we get that scene, and then it's also that, and this is something that like Martin does so well later in Game of Thrones, is you have this character who seems like he's invincible,
right?
And then you take him down,
right.
And you don't actually get to see him do. I mean, later we hear about some of the crazy stuff he did, but you don't actually see him do anything. It's all just people's like respect for him,
right.
and his legend has grown so big. And then he shows that like that doesn't matter because even he can get killed.
Yeah.
Well, then Sonny as well. When Sonny goes down, it's like he's another one of those. He's basically having to take over, and Sonny is seen as like the strong force. And when he goes down, it's like, who's really left? And then Michael's there to pick up the pieces.
I mean, he's also, it kind of clears the way, right? Like these characters have to get cleared out for Michael to ascend. And the same with Vito. Like I think that's like the father has to die for him to truly inherit the role and become the new Godfather, right? Like he could never really be that as long as Vito is alive. Luca Brasi is also interesting. There's also a really fascinating part I found where after all of that and after we've known all the legend, he finds out more, and he finds out that Luca actually like murdered his own child that he had, and that was like his dark secret. And so I like the way that totally takes this character that like I think he knows like, oh, you like this character, do you? And then I'm going to show you like how brutal someone like that actually is. And then I was left feeling weird about the fact that I was so into this Luca character. But it also felt right. Like it felt like that character to do the things that he did, especially also the stuff with Al Capone's men, the description of how he dealt with the Al Capone men. It's crazy. Started like chopping them from like feet up with an axe or something. It was wild. And then one of them just swallowed like a shirt to kill himself.
Right.
Really, really brutal, but cool scenes.
It's great how he sets Luca up as this larger than life character, and yet has him killed in like a really sort of, very like just knocked off, almost matter of factly. And
he doesn't like take anyone down with him.
Exactly. It's like it's very much the sort of like live by the sword, die by the sword kind of scenario, right? But it's interesting because you don't actually get much page time with Luca Brasi at all.
No.
But he's this like sort of, it's almost like he's the hand of the dawn, like he's a weapon, right? That like the family needs, and it's a way of reminding the reader that like, you've got all these characters who are very, honestly, like very soft-spoken, very reasonable people, but they're backed up by just like brute violence. And the Don, a part of, the greatness of the Don is that he knows this and he has Luca Brasi as part of his power structure.
And speaking of back for the Don, I also really loved his backstory. There's like a part of the book where we get his rise to power, and I didn't think we were going to get that, and I loved it. Like it was so cool for them to talk about like each step along the way of him becoming the Godfather.
Yeah, just wait until you get to the second movie.
I was about to say that. I was literally about to say you're going to love the second movie then.
Yeah, the whole structure of this book is a little all over the place. If I recall correctly, it's like it's broken up into like 7 parts or something like that.
Books. They call them books. Yeah.
And the structure, I'm not sure if Puzo had and put much thought into the structure, to be perfectly honest, because we start with the family, and we kind of follow the main plot for quite a while, and then we've got like then we go back and forth to Fontane. We go to Sicily with Michael, and then we go all the way back in time to Vito's backstory, and then we come back. So it's not like a very neatly structured book, but it does feel as if, to your point, Luke, that it's almost like fable-like, because it's of the omniscient voice and these like these situations where you're getting the major plot points in after they've happened, and you're moving around. It's almost like the omniscient storyteller is like, okay, well now let's talk about the backstory of the Dawn, and let's spend a book doing that. it's not actually that long a book, but it packs a lot in there.
Oh yeah.
And almost like, and there's parts that you could have cut, obviously. In my mind.
Talking about how uneven it is, you have a book devoted to that like integral awesome part, and then you have a whole book devoted to Lucy and her like vaginal surgery.
Like how are those both books?
That's a whole book.
Like how are those books?
What? Yeah. Like, oh my God. Yeah. And I think there's a couple others like that where it felt very like, okay, I think it's the Johnny Fontane stuff. We often get like a whole book about Johnny.
Right.
And it would be like him going to parties, and then you get the thing with Nino coming out and him introducing Nino, and then you also, I don't know.
I mean, I think there's like 2.5 straight pages of like Johnny's, womanizing and his predilection for virgins or something.
yeah. Which is, and it's made in a way to make him seem like better than the other actors in Hollywood. Like it's all like, it's like he's such a womanizer, but it's okay because he actually like talks to women too and cares a little bit. So we're supposed to say it's okay. Like, I don't know. Yeah, a lot of that stuff was really sort of bizarre and it felt very wish fulfillment to me too. Like if you're like this, I'm telling you it's okay because like you're not that bad. There are worse people than you. And everybody cheats on everybody, right? Like nobody's faithful in this society. Even Michael, our hero, gets married to this woman that he never even speaks to, and he already decides he wants to marry her because he gets like the thunderstruck or whatever. So that was kind of weird, and he just like decides to marry this, and then she only serves the purpose of dying and then being like Michael's going to avenge her.
That's right? Yeah, I don't think she actually has any speaking lines in the book that I can really think of.
I agree.
So brilliant and yet so flawed.
Yeah, I think she speaks only in Italian.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting book. I had a lot of fun with it for sure. Let me end with this final bit of plot here, and we can talk about the end, I guess. The novel culminates when Michael has his two main enemies, the novel's main antagonist, Emilio Barzini, and a lesser but severely important antagonist, Philip Tattaglia, assassinated. After the total elimination of the Tattaglia family and the Barzini family, Michael sells all of his business in New York with the intention of making Corleone Family a legitimate business in Las Vegas. So there is also like that interesting arc of like, first off, there's two things going on there. There's the culmination and the sort of like just desserts and the revenge that's been planned for so long, which is definitely terrifying. Like you were talking about, the idea that people could be planning to kill you for years and just like talking to you to your face and seeming so friendly, and then actually like, no, this has all just been a plan to kill you. That's terrifying in a sense too, right? Like what never knowing what's going on. And then you get sort of the move of the Corleone family kind of going legit, which is also kind of an interesting part of this plot.
Well, and it goes to what Don Vito wanted, because he didn't want to get into narcotics and everything. He knew that was going to be too illegitimate. So I think that Michael sees that as like the template to go off of. He's like, the more legitimate we get, the safer we're going to be going forward, especially with like the new power structure that's coming in. But I also definitely want to talk about the fact that Michael becomes a full-on godfather. He becomes the godfather of Connie's kid. Mm-hmm. And the fact that the idea that he, in quick succession, becomes a godfather and like is taking on this role and then quickly eliminates any enemies that he has and any basically threats coming at them, and then while also expanding, I think is really showing how he's going to continue on. And I think that you'll be interested to see what happens in Godfather Part 2. Yeah,
this is one place where I think the films really do kind of take the source material and then extrapolate it and become their own story. Because the book really sort of ends with Michael establishing the security of his leadership. There's a part after the Don dies where Michael has the conference with like Tessio and Clemenza and Hagen, and he's nominally the Godfather now, but he's not yet the Godfather in like kind of true, in the true sense. They're not yet calling him Don Corleone. And his position seems very far from secure, because now that the Don Vito is dead, they lose his personal connections to the politicians and the judges and all that stuff. And there's definitely this sense of like, oh, now the great man is dead, and like all the enemies are gonna kind of like come together, and there's going to be there's going to be a reckoning. They're going to try and take Michael out, which kind of leads to Tessio's death, right? That whole like, okay, someone's going to come to you to try and make the peace, and that's going to be the traitor. And it's interesting because Tessio is like this big lieutenant throughout the story, helps them in the war and all that, is a loyal guy, but it seems like at the end he believes that the Corleones can't win, so he has to throw in his lot with the enemy, and obviously loses his life because of it. So it ends with Michael kind of putting to rest these questions of whether or not he can take his father's place, and that's where the book ends. And it sets up the story for actually a lot more, which is where I think the movies rightfully eclipse the books, because they go past that question of like, okay, so how does he actually do it, and what cost does he have to pay?
Mm-hmm. I think the question that comes up to me, and I'm assuming this is addressed in the movies, is it possible for this person and this family to move beyond the criminal enterprise and go legit? And is that possible? Because we see that it's been passed on from Vito to Michael, and we see that Michael's having children of his own, and he wants them. He talks about wanting them to go on to be, professors and not be part of this world. And I think the question becomes like, is that possible? Can you escape the sort of family? I guess there's like a cycle of violence built into this family. And this is we've seen this in other works as well. Like Stephen King loves to do stuff about cycles of violence being passed on, and I think you can see that in this too. Except for instead of like abuse, it's more like the violence of the family against everything, against the world, and how when you're born into that, how inescapable it seems like it is to me. Like, because I severely doubt that this is possible for him.
Oh, and I think. That's where one of the reasons why The Godfather Part 3 is disappointing, because it could have, I think you could have seen more of an answer to that question than you do in the Godfather Part 3. I think definitely what Godfather Part 2 does is really show that Michael he makes moves to make the family more legitimate, but can't escape that cycle of violence at all. In fact, becomes like more pulled into it even further. And Michael's kids, they feature prominently in the third movie, but they don't ever really come into their, like, there's not the sort of succession story that you find in The Godfather Part 1. That's not part of Godfather Part 3, in the sense that, like, I feel like The Godfather Part 3 sort of tries to address what you were asking, but doesn't fully succeed. And I know we're not going to talk specifically about The Godfather Part 3, but I think part of the reason why it's a little disappointing is because it doesn't answer that question.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that. I can see that being frustrating.
So I just have one more like kind of scene that we passed over that I wanted to talk to you guys about, that I felt was like, I think it really rivals some of the stuff that goes on in the movie, is the meeting of the five families and the speech that Vito gives, and the way that he tries to play to their compassion. And he basically says, like, we want our kids to grow up and be painters, and like you were talking about, like, be scholars and go on to do these great things. And we need to prop them up with like our courage in this moment and like stop fighting. I just thought that was really powerful stuff. Like he really killed that scene and like cemented what like Don Vito's legacy would be for the family and everything. And I think that Michael tries to emulate that and to a differing level of success.
Yeah, that's a great scene, because this is one of those moments where, like, as a writer, you kind of understand this idea that there's what's said and then there's like what's unsaid, right? So there's like what the actual characters are saying, but then like what you kind of know is going on underneath, right? Like, and you find out later that, like, the Don is making the piece for a very pragmatic reason, because he wants his son back. and he doesn't want there to be any trouble, and he needs to kind of buy his family time. But and yet this scene with the 5 families is so it's so great, because like you kind of get these different characters. You can really picture it, but the Don comes across as really forgiving and magnanimous and like morally upstanding, and also there's other stuff going on. Like this isn't it. This isn't just the surface speech he's given. Like he's got other things in his mind.
And what's crazy is that the other heads of the families don't realize that. Like, how could they not know that he's gonna get them for all the stuff that's going on? But he's just that like magnetic, like that engaging, and like they all just like respond to what he says and buy into it, and hope. I guess they're hoping that it all ends more peacefully.
Yeah, he's convincing, right?
I'm also not entirely sure they do buy it, because I get the sense that after he's dead, they probably figure, now's the time to go after the Corleone.
Yeah, that's true.
And there's this sort of like balance that all the characters are playing of like, is it business or is it personal? And there's actually a speech between Tom and Mike where Tom is basically like, it's business, like, all this is business or something. And then Mike basically says, well, no, the truth is it's all personal. That's like the reason why like my father is a great man, is because like he takes it all personal. And so there's that's sort of like, you hear it all the time. Like you hear the characters oftentimes say it's not personal, it's just business. But no, it's personal. So that kind of like that play with like sort of the morality of what they're doing is interesting too, because it's like you can really rationalize. They're rationalizing the violence, but like, come on, like you know that it's personal. So.
Well, and that's like Sonny's flaw, is that he doesn't have the ability to pretend, right? Like he wears it on his sleeves. He takes everything personally, which everybody does, but he doesn't have that veneer of like, oh no, I don't take this personally, and due to his temper. But going back to that scene with the Godfather and the families, I love. There's a part where he starts talking about how reasonable he is, and how he just he wants his son back. But I love the part where he talks about how he's also superstitious, and how if certain things were to befall Michael, and he has this list of things that could happen, and then he ends with, and if he were even struck by lightning, I would still, due to my superstition, believe that somebody here had something to do with it. Right. It's so cool because it's all subtext, and it's all like, nothing better happened to him, or I am going to blame you. So cool, like very well done. And then also the omniscient narrator tells us that the speech would be remembered like Churchill's speech, and which really elevates it to like this would go on to live in legend.
Right.
And which is really cool. It sets it up, and then he delivers too, right? Like he sets it up like this is gonna be really epic, and then it is, which is very well done, very cool. All right, so I think this is probably a good spot because we're gonna come back to this story a lot for the movies. So this is probably a good stop to leave it for now. I have a lot of stuff I didn't get to in my notes, but I think it's fine because I think we'll have more opportunities to revisit as we go forward. But before we stop, I do want to remind everybody that we're going to be reading Jade City while we watch the movie, or the week of watching the movie. So we invite our listeners to do it as well. And we're not going to cover Jade City, and in fact, I hope that we'll be able to cover it when it's one day adapted. That would be really cool. I personally picture like a Netflix series. I think is where I see it. But
it's definitely, I think, too. Having just turned in the second book, it would be too much to fit into a film if such a thing were to ever happen.
But yeah, so I invite our listeners to join us in doing that. But otherwise, where can people find you online, Fonda?
Oh, they can find me on my website, which is fondalee.com, or on Twitter @FondaJLee.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm really looking forward to speaking with you again next week and the week after about the movies. I think it's going to be really fun, and this was awesome. This was a delight.
Likewise. Talk to you guys soon.
Okay, this week we want to thank one of our patrons. He's been a longtime patron, Chris C. Thank you for your continued support. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, and if you'd like to find out how to become a patron, visit patreon.com/ink2film. Also, if you have any feedback you'd like to send us or any questions about The Godfather, especially if you have anything for Fonda, send that on to ink2film@gmail.com, or you can message us on one of our many social media sites like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, where we're at ink2film on all of those.
Another way to help out the podcast is to leave a rating or review on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. We just passed the 50 mark, so we're looking to go to 100 now. So if you want to help us
that'll be our new goal.
Journey, our journey to 100, we would really appreciate a rating and review.
And this week we wanted to thank AJ Pro and Universal Free Beats for the use of our intro and outro music.
And thank you one more time to Fonda for coming on. It was so much fun, and we're looking forward to watching the movie and talking to you about that next week.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm looking forward to getting into her book, Jade City. Once again, we invite all our listeners to check out that book. And we'll be back next week for the film. Until next time.
Thanks for listening.